When we're young, when we're 14, 15 years old, or maybe even younger than that, and you tell your parents what you want to be when you grow up. Most of us say we want to be a professional baseball player or a professional basketball or football player. And when we do that when we're young kids, what's the first thing that comes out of our parents' mouths? Well, that's great, Timmy, but you better go to college and have a backup plan just in case plan A doesn't work out for you and you don't make it into the NBA. The New Orleans Saints just signed their backup plan. About a month ago, I came on here and I made the case of why Jameis Winston would benefit by signing with the Saints. And actually, I made the case why it would benefit both him and the team. It would give Winston at least 1 year to sit behind Drew Brees and learn what it takes to be an effective quarterback. It would also give Sean Payton and the Saints an insurance policy in case Drew Brees gets hurt again and is forced to miss some games. I told you guys that in the case of both Cam Newton and Jameis Winston, teams would likely wait until after the draft before they pick them up, because otherwise it would affect their compensatory picks in the 2021 draft. So that is exactly what the Saints did with Jameis Winston. Waited until after the draft. They say great minds think alike. Sean Payton obviously thought the same thing about Jameis Winston as I did, because the Saints are going to bring him to New Orleans. But it got me to thinking, what does this mean for Taysom Hill? For the past 2 or 3 years, I've heard Sean Payton state on a number of occasions that Taysom Hill is going to be the successor to Drew Brees in New Orleans. Now, there's a lot of people that have doubts about that, and I understand with good reason. Taysom Hill's going to be 30 years old in August. I can't think of any player that steps in at 30, 31 years old and becomes a starting quarterback in the NFL. It just doesn't happen that way. The only guy I can think of that was close to that was Chris Winkie when he came out of Florida State. And he was a fucking bust. So that's a bad example. At the beginning of this offseason, I feel like Taysom Hill kind of put the Saints in a bit of a bind. He came out publicly and stated that he wanted to be a starting quarterback in the NFL. And if it was not going to be in New Orleans, then it was going to be somewhere else. Now, obviously, Sean Payton didn't want to lose him. There isn't another player in the league that is comparable to Taysom Hill. He can run, he can pass, he can play as a receiver, tight end, block, return kicks, play in coverage on special teams. There's not a fucking position on the field that Taysom Hill can't play. So, Sean Payton couldn't afford to let him test the free agent market, which is why they gave him $21 million over 2 years. In my opinion, too much money. I think the Saints overpaid him a bit. It's going to be tough for them to make the case to Alvin Kamara that he should take a contract in the $6-8 million range when they just committed $11 million a year to Taysom Hill, a guy who sees the field about half the time that Alvin Kamara does, if not less than that. The way Hill's contract is structured, it's kind of like a prove your worth agreement. And what I mean when I say that, New Orleans didn't want to commit to him long term. So they gave Taysom Hill 2 years, which means assuming Drew Brees retires after this season, he's got 2021 to prove himself, to have the opportunity to prove that he can be a starter in this league. But now there's a little curveball thrown into the mix. Now Sean Payton brings in Jameis Winston. Now, most people will say, well, the Saints needed a backup quarterback. No shit, that's true. But with Drew Brees possibly playing his last season in 2020, you don't bring a guy like Jameis Winston in with the mindset of being a backup. Chase Daniel, Mason Rudolph, guys like that, those are backup quarterbacks. I think that the Saints are bringing in Jameis Winston to compete with Taysom Hill for the starting job in 2021. Now, does this mean that Sean Payton has lost faith in Taysom Hill as the successor to Drew Brees? Becoming a starting quarterback in the NFL isn't like being trained as an insurance salesman. Here's your training manual. Go talk to that guy in the wheelchair into buying a whole life insurance policy. It's not like that. Doesn't work that way. The quarterback position in the NFL is the hardest position in all of professional sports. Very few people can do it. We've got 32 teams in the league, and it seems like damn near half the league every year is looking for a starting quarterback. Bringing in Jameis Winston is a brilliant move by Sean Payton. You've got a proven starter on the sideline in case Drew Brees gets hurt. This also allows Sean Payton to continue to use Taysom Hill like he has the past couple of years. If New Orleans didn't have a proven backup, you can't put Taysom Hill out there on 3rd and 1. You can't have him returning punts because you would need him to be the starting quarterback in case Drew Brees got hurt. So you can't risk him in plays like that. He can no longer be your Swiss Army knife. It also creates a quarterback competition next year for Drew Brees' job. Now, I know the Saints only signed Jameis Winston on a 1-year deal, but he wants to be in New Orleans. He received a much better offer from the Pittsburgh Steelers. He chose the Saints instead. I think part of the appeal was the opportunity to learn under Drew Brees, something that revitalized the career of Teddy Bridgewater. If anyone can help Jameis Winston cut down on his turnovers, learn preparation, learn what it takes to be an efficient starter, it's Sean Payton and Drew Brees. I don't think bringing in Jameis Winston means that Sean Payton has lost faith in Taysom Hill as a starter, but it gives him one hell of a backup plan, one hell of an insurance policy. Taysom Hill's only thrown 15 passes his entire NFL career. He's unproven. Jameis Winston, you take away the turnovers. I know that's a big if, but if you take away the turnovers, he would be a top 5 quarterback in the NFL. It just gives Payton an option if Taysom Hill doesn't have what it takes, doesn't work out his plan. Sean Payton and the Saints can fall back on Jameis Winston. That's all Jameis Winston is at this point. Sean Payton's backup plan in case Taysom Hill doesn't work out like he expects. It's a brilliant move by Sean Payton. Now, it was a great weekend all around for the Saints because I also think that they did well in the draft. Now, I see where a lot of these so-called draft experts are giving the Saints a C grade for the draft, but that doesn't make much sense to me. Just because the Saints didn't have 16 or however many fucking picks the Minnesota Vikings ended up with doesn't mean it was a poor draft class for New Orleans. For Sean Payton, the draft has always been about quality over quantity. No one in the NFL handles the draft like Sean Payton does. He isn't afraid to trade future late round picks to get the player that he thinks can contribute right away. The Saints have a stacked roster anyway, so they didn't really need a large number of picks. They drafted Cesar Ruiz in the first round at center, which should shore up the hole in the middle of the offensive line. He will start week 1. They addressed their need at linebacker now that A.J. Klein is gone. Drafted Zach Bond. He will start week 1. I see some critics claiming that the Saints needed a receiver and a cornerback. Now, this draft was deep with wide receivers. I'll give them that. But did everyone fucking forget that New Orleans signed Emmanuel Sanders in free agency? They needed a center and a linebacker more than they needed another fucking receiver on this roster. They've also got Janoris Jenkins lined up opposite Marshawn Lattimore. Now, the depth at corner is an issue, but that's something that can be resolved with a trade or over the summer. Like I said, New Orleans didn't need a high number of picks in this draft. When you have a roster as stacked as the Saints have, it's a waste to draft 7, 8 players. Back in 2018, they drafted 7 players. Only 3 of them made the roster through training camp. That That was 2 years ago. The Saints are better now than they were then. Let's go ahead and get to the rest of the NFL draft. The NFL draft is officially over. And I'll be perfectly honest with you guys. I don't really get into the NFL draft. It's not my favorite event of the NFL all season. I know it's a big event for a lot of you guys out there. A lot of people like it. I actually prefer the NBA draft to the NFL draft, mainly because it's not as time consuming. But what I'm going to do today, I'm going to pick a few teams that I think did pretty good in the draft and briefly go over them. And I'm also going to pick a few teams that I really wasn't impressed with. Now, I think the Green Bay Packers had the worst draft class of any team in the league. And it's nothing against the players that they selected. Some of their picks could be contributors in the future, but to me, the Packers were looking too far into the future with the way they handled this draft and not concerned enough with improving the roster for a Super Bowl run in 2020. I covered all of this in a video I posted on Sunday, so you can go check it out in the archives. I'm not going to go over the Packers again today. So let's go and get to it. I'm going to start with a few of the teams that I thought drafted pretty good. Now, this is in no particular order, just some of my observations from the weekend. I'm going to start with the Detroit Lions, since last week when I was talking about Matt Patricia and Bob Quinn being on the hot seat, I said that they needed to have a really good draft to get some positive momentum going into this offseason. I don't think the Lions necessarily hit a home run in the draft, but I thought they did well addressing the needs of the team. A lot of people are criticizing Detroit for not trading down, but we don't know what offers, if any, were made. Obviously, if there were offers made, Detroit didn't think they were good enough, so they held on to their number 3 pick, addressed the need at cornerback, and drafted Jeff Okudah. I thought this was a great pick. Detroit needed someone to step in and replace Darius Slay in that secondary. Okudah's a special player. He was dominant at Ohio State. Last 3 years, only 50% of the passes that were thrown his way were caught by an opposing receiver. Over the last 2 years, he has damn near as many forced incompletions as he does first downs allowed. He could be another Marshawn Lattimore type player. Now, people are also criticizing Detroit for drafting Deandre Swift in the 2nd round. I actually like this pick too. Kerryon Johnson is a good running back. He's okay. But he's always fucking hurt. He's always on the sideline. 2 years in the league, he's already missed 14 games. Deandre Swift isn't what I would call a special player. A can't-miss prospect is a term that we heard all weekend long. But it makes sense to have an insurance policy in case Kerryon Johnson gets hurt for the 3rd year in a row. I thought Detroit and Matt Patricia did well in the later rounds as well. Got a nice edge rusher and Julian Okwara, who some thought would be drafted earlier than the 3rd round. The Lions drafted a couple of guards to shore up that piss-poor offensive line. Overall, I think Matt Patricia and Bob Quinn did a pretty good job. Now, whether or not this translates on the field is anyone's guess. Detroit drafted well last year, and they still assumed their usual position at the bottom of the NFC North. But after a controversial start to the offseason for Matt Patricia, where there were several former players that came out and publicly blasted him, the Lions finally got some positive momentum in this draft. I thought the Minnesota Vikings had one of, if not the best draft class of any team in the league. There was a lot of blowback when the Vikings traded Stephon Diggs a few weeks ago. They made up for all of that in the 1st round when they drafted Justin Jefferson out of LSU. This dude is going to be a stud in the NFL. He reminds me of a Michael Thomas in New Orleans. Now, I'm not saying he's going to be that great. I'm not saying he's going to be the number 1 receiver in the league, but Justin Jefferson has the potential to be an elite receiver. He has more speed than Michael Thomas. Great route runner. He's going to fit well in the Vikings offensive system. Minnesota had the best 1st round of any team in the draft. They had 2 first-round picks, used their last one to draft a potential replacement for Xavier Rhodes in the secondary. Jeff Gladney is small. There's no doubt about it. But Mike Zimmer is great at extenuating the strengths of his players, especially on defense. Gladney's a tough motherfucker. He ran the 40 at the combine with a torn meniscus. He's going to fit in really good with Mike Zimmer. The Vikings addressed their defense most of the draft, especially in the secondary, since they lost 3 corners this offseason. I rarely have positive comments on this channel about the Dallas Cowboys and the Cincinnati Bengals, but I thought both teams did pretty good in the draft. Jerry Jones has made a lot of questionable personnel decisions over the last 3 decades. He's made a lot of poor draft choices. Quincy Carter stands out to me as one of the worst. When Bill Parcells can't teach you to consistently win, there's a fucking problem. But Jerry Jones really boosted the Cowboys roster in this draft. Took CeeDee Lamb in the first round, which is a huge upgrade over Randall Cobb. Picked up Trayvon Diggs from Alabama. I always like any defender that is coming out of college that was coached by Nick Saban. Diggs is the perfect fit for the Cowboys' press-heavy defensive system. Now, it would have been really hard for the Bengals to fuck up this draft. I don't think it was a surprise to anyone that they drafted Joe Burrow number 1 overall. They picked up T. Higgins in the second round, which was a smart choice. Who knows if A.J. Green will ever be the player that he used to be. And the Bengals needed another receiver in case A.J. Green goes down with another injury. Higgins is a big play receiver. Joe Burrow is a big play quarterback. They are going to fit perfectly together. Now, that being said, I have little to no expectations for the Bengals to be any good in 2020. And I also think it's going to be a tough season in Dallas as well. Dak Prescott and this contract situation, if it does not get resolved, it's going to be a black cloud hanging over that locker room in Dallas the entire season. All right, let's go over a couple of teams that didn't do so well, or I thought were outright terrible. No team fucked the draft up worse than the Green Bay Packers, but there were a couple that I really wasn't impressed with. One being the Philadelphia Eagles. Now, before I start, let me just say that I don't think Philly struck out in the draft by any stretch. I actually like them picking up Jalen Hurts in the second round. Now, I know a lot of people think Jalen Hurts can be a Taysom Hill type player for Philadelphia. I don't see that happening. To me, Jalen Hurts is Carson Wentz insurance. Carson Wentz stays hurt. He hasn't been the most dependable player the past 4 years. So Jalen Hurts gives Doug Peterson a legit option if Carson Wentz is forced to miss a game or two during the season. I don't think Jalen Hurts is ready to be a long-term starter. Don't get me wrong, but if Wentz goes down week 1 for the season, the Eagles are fucked. But Jalen Hurts is a viable option to step in for a game or two while he is developing. I think he can do that. But there were some draft selections that the Eagles made that I just didn't understand. How the fuck do you pick Jalen Reagor over Justin Jefferson? That makes no sense to me. Didn't you draft another speed receiver in John Hightower when Philadelphia's already got Deshaun Jackson? So now they've got 3 speed receivers on the roster, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but the Eagles' picks could have been used to fill some of their biggest needs on defense. The Eagles' biggest need in the draft besides receiver was linebacker and cornerback. And I wasn't impressed. They didn't even draft a fucking corner, which is puzzling to me. And the linebackers they drafted aren't going to be ready to start week 1. Davion Taylor is a project. He pretty much started playing football while he was in college at Colorado. Now, he's the potential to be a good player, but not something that's going to help the Eagles this year. The Eagles usually draft well. I was surprised by Philadelphia in this draft, but this wasn't one of Howie Roseman's better drafts by any stretch. Now, let's get to one of my favorite punching bags on this channel. Bill O'Brien and the Houston Texans. He never disappoints me. Since I've criticized every move he's made this offseason, it wouldn't be right for me not to dissect his draft selections and just find issues with them. Let's start with Bill O'Brien's first round pick. Oh, Sorry, wait a minute. He didn't have one because he traded it away for Laramie Tunsil last summer, who he overpaid a few weeks ago and made him the highest paid offensive lineman in the NFL. The Texans defense was putrid last season. They were fucking awful. Secondary, terrible. The pass rush was damn near non-existent when J.J. Watt was out injured. Now, in my opinion, the secondary was the biggest need defensively because when J.J. Watt is healthy, the Texans at least have a semblance of a pass rush. But Bill O'Brien waited until the 4th round, the 3rd fucking day of the draft, to address his needs in the secondary. This draft, like it was with wide receivers, was deep with cornerbacks. But O'Brien looked past all of them in the 2nd round to draft Ross Blacklock, a defensive lineman out of TCU. Waste of a pick, in my opinion. He is terrible against the run. Not an elite pass rusher at this point, and he's got an extensive history with injuries. Tore his Achilles in 2018. Tore a pectoral muscle in 2019. But it got even worse in the 3rd round for the Texans, as Bill O'Brien drafted Jonathan Granard. Another waste of a pick. Another lineman with extensive injury history. Granard was dominated when going up against elite offensive linemen in the SEC last year. So I'm not sure what makes Bill O'Brien think he's not going to struggle at the NFL level. The Texans only had 5 picks in this draft because Bill O'Brien has made it a point, a favorite hobby of his, to trade away draft picks. So it was imperative that he make the most of each pick, and I think he failed miserably. Let me mention the Chicago Bears real quick before we close out. I wasn't impressed with Matt Nagy and the Bears in this draft. This is a big year in Chicago for Matt Nagy. They didn't have a first rounder, sent that one to Oakland or Las Vegas and the Khalil Mack deal. So the Bears couldn't draft until the 2nd round. And they go out and they draft another fucking tight end. They've got 100 tight ends on this roster. I guess Matt Nagy is dead set on building a roster of nothing but tight ends on offense. They just signed Demetrius Harris this offseason. Then went out and overpaid Jimmy Graham. Now they drafted another tight end in the 2nd round in Cole Kmet. Good player, but do the Bears really fucking need him? Do they need another tight end on this roster? Chicago is desperate for a playmaker on offense. A guy that can go out and burn defenses deep. Because they don't have a guy on this roster that can do that. They didn't draft one either. This, to me, was their biggest need and their biggest mistake by not doing it. They ranked near the bottom of the league last year in big plays. KJ Hamler out of Penn State, a speedy receiver that could have helped fix this problem, was still available when they drafted Cole Kmet. Overall, I just wasn't impressed with Matt Nagy and the Bears. Alright, that's all for today. Make sure to hit that like and subscribe button. Click the notification bell to receive all notifications from the channel. Leave me a comment in the section below. Let me know what you think about the Saints signing Jameis Winston. What does it mean for Taysom Hill? Give me your thoughts on the draft. Did your team do well, or were they a bust? You can follow me on Twitter at KC_BTL84. If you have any questions, you can email me at BTLKC84@gmail.com. I will see you guys next time.